When we talk about how to read the Bible, we have to look first at the type of writing that we're looking at. So sometimes the writing is the wisdom books, which are simply stories to help us understand how to live a good life. Sometimes the writings are historical, and we look at those writings a little differently. And then we look at the Torah, which is the early writings, which started out as oral traditions, and then at the time of Moses, those books were then basically written at that time. So we have to look at them a little differently than the historical books. And then finally, the prophets are, again, written basically telling us how God has inspired people to give all of his people messages that he wants them to know. So the purpose of the Bible is it's basically showing us God's interaction with people. It's not a history book and it's not a science book. So we can't look at the Bible as a history book or as a science book if we want to make sense of it and try to get what's important about it that we need to know. In the Genesis creation accounts, God does not make people understand the science that we have when they explain how the universe is created. They do it with what their understanding is, and we need to accept that, but also realize that there's spiritual truths that are given through those stories that we need to accept.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day.
People inspired by God still had the knowledge they had of the world, and they explained the creation as best they could with that understanding. But the spiritual truths were still there for us to get. If we were creating that story, it would look something like this today. And now we get to another objection some people have about the Bible, or the creation story and Adam and Eve, and try to understand that. Again, people understood things as best they could, and God was giving spiritual truths, and our faith doesn't depend on evolution not being true or being true. There's also another theory called intelligent design, where God is working behind the scenes. At any rate, this is the argument that we also look at. It's like, how does God create things? We don't know how that process is. We just know that as a Christian, we believe that God did create things.
The question has to do with the teleological argument, the argument for design, that sort of thing. Recently on the Unbelievable podcast with Justin Briley, shout out to Justin Briley.
Yep.
He had two guys on there to talk about stance on theistic evolution, and the idea that if God did in fact create the universe with a design and a purpose and an end goal to glorify Him, presumably, what role does evolution play in that? And can we, as theists, so to speak, subscribe to a view that supports evolution? How do you respond when people ask you about evolution?
Yeah, because evolution is not a salvation issue. Okay.
Correct.
Yes, you can be a Christian and believe in evolution, like Francis Collins does.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's the founder of the Human Genome Project, or the director of it, I should say, and he wrote a book called Language of God. In any event, sometimes when people say, "Do you believe in evolution?" you've got to stop and say, "What do you mean by evolution?"
Yeah.
Because it means so many different things. If you mean change over time, count me in. We see change over time.
Absolutely.
Microevolution, adaptation within a type, count me in. We see that. But if you mean molecules to man without intelligence, I don't think we not only, I think we don't see that. We actually see evidence against that. Like the fossil record, irreducible complexity, epigenetic information, genetic limits to change, and some other things, okay? This is evidence against macroevolution. But let me say this. We can argue all day about that topic. We can get down in the weeds on it. I could even grant somebody that macroevolution is true. I don't think it is. As I say, I think there's evidence against it, but even if it's true.
Even if it is true.
Even if it's true, it doesn't get rid of the need for God. It doesn't mean Christianity's false. You still need a universe. You still need life. You still need somebody like God to ground objective moral values, consciousness, reason, the laws of logic. All these things are best explained by an immaterial intelligent realm, i.e. God, rather than a naturalistic realm, which is what the molecules to man evolutionists want to do.
The Bible is telling a bigger story than the creation of the earth or the universe. It's telling a story about a spiritual world that exists alongside this one. I've got the next clip that's going to deal with a person that's an exorcist that's explaining the incarnation, which is God becoming a man in his effort to save us, and Calvinists come back to him. And a little bit of insight into what's that whole story about in the garden with Adam and Eve and the fall of man and God coming into the world as a man and the fall of the angels. All of that kind of just comes together in this story a little better than just simply reading the story of Adam and Eve.
The origin of Satan is that Satan was not a created being as Satan. The word Satan comes from the Hebrew Satan, which means adversary. But Satan was once Lucifer, God's greatest angel, known as the angel of light. So, how did all this begin? It begins with the incarnation, which we oftentimes simply think of as Christmas. But at Christmas, at the incarnation, when Christ embraces, as the second person of the Blessed Trinity, when Christ embraces our human nature and retains his divine nature, it is then that the rebellion in heaven takes place. And the rebellion in heaven takes place because our human nature is lower than that of the nature of the angelic. And it meant that Satan and the angelic realm would have to worship and honor and give glory to the God-man. The notion of God lowering himself below that of the nature of angels was what caused the rebellion. It's Michael and those loyal to the Trinity that force Lucifer and a third of the angels, according to the book of Revelation, into the abode we call hell. Biblically speaking, what prompted the incarnation? Because that doesn't happen in a vacuum either. And it culminates with the crucifixion. If you look at the Bible, at the two bookends, the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation. In the book of Genesis, Satan isn't, the term Satan is not even used. It's the serpent. It is Lucifer who manifests himself as a serpent because he seduces Adam and Eve into believing that they can become like gods as well. And so when sin is introduced, it is then obviously, from what we know from Genesis, it is then that the human race falls out of that perfect relationship. It falls out of grace. And so the Father, in order to try and help restore the human race, calls patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, to create the nation of God's chosen people and establishing the covenant of Abraham with God and Moses with God. And those covenants were broken over and over and over. And so the Father calls forth prophets, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Jeremiah, and many others, whose mission it was to be the pronouncer of God's will and to help restore fidelity to the Mosaic covenant. And their mission fails too. And so that's when the incarnation takes place. And so the one perfect sacrifice of Christ on the cross is what heals the estrangement between the human race and God caused by sin.
That is the story of the Bible that we're going to tell. We're going to start with the first section of the Old Testament, which is known as the Torah. We're going to look at the historical books. We're going to look at the wisdom books, and we're going to look at the prophetic books. And then we're going to look at the New Testament, its sections. And then finally, we're going to look at a section we call the church, which is simply God continuing to make his presence known in the world after the official Bible ends. And that's the story that the next sections of this presentation will deal with.